Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Our guest today in the studio is Afrose Ahmed, who is a recent resident of Port Townsend, Washington, a writer, a poet, a political activist, and someone very interesting to talk to. So I'm going to do an interactive bio with Afrose so we can learn more about her history and her coming to writing and her efforts now to teach others. Welcome.
Thank you, Sheila, so much for having me on the air.
I've heard about you, and now I get to meet you in person and have a wonderful discussion about you and about writing and its outgrowth in your life from your political endeavors and work. So let's start with what you're doing today in your own writing. And you've told me before we opened the show that your seriousness with your own writing, although you've been writing all your life, has come about in the last couple of years. So maybe we should start there.
I was raised in an immigrant Indian family, and the options on the table for what one did with their life was to be a doctor or engineer. And so I grew up very passionate about social justice and thought that I would go to law school, and that was quite radical from my background. I spent my 20s working as a social worker in domestic violence, very involved in radical political organizing, particularly Palestine solidarity. I spent a year in the Middle East about 10 years ago. But a couple years ago, my sister passed away quite suddenly, and we were very close. And it really caused me to reassess what was important to me, what has meaning and heart and vitality in my life, what I want to wake up doing every day. And so I've always been a writer, and I'd always been writing poetry, and I never felt really that I could take it seriously. I found myself in the realm of what Julia Cameron calls the shadow artists. So, I ended up going to grad school and to translate Urdu poetry, which is the language that my family speaks. And as a translator, there is some creative work involved, but it's really about another poet's words and speech. So, about a couple years ago, I got really serious. I self-published my first chapbook called He Won't Dance With Me. Along with a lot of other transitions, I just moved into being a writer in the world. And that's a great deal of what brought me to Port Townsend. I knew, particularly with the Writers' Workshop, that there was a wonderful community for writers here. And I found it incredibly nurturing.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm so sorry to hear about your sister.
Thank you.
I think any loss is devastating. The loss of a sibling who you've shared so much growing up with must be really hard. So I'm going to ask you, do you think that her life and her spirit inform your poetry?
Absolutely. She was quite instrumental in shaping my character and passion in the world. She herself was very politically active, very caring. And I think that now as I move into my writing, I'm able to see my writing as my tool of change and input into the world.
And you write about that. I've read about that on your website, and that to have an openness towards the world is perhaps one of the most functional things we can do. Yeah. And poetry demands that
absolutely.
Of us. Your chapbook is available in town?
It's available at the Writers' Workshop. It's available on my website as well when I'm out and about doing various activities in public, which we'll talk about. I also sell it.
How did you make the decision to self-publish?
It was really important to me to feel engaged in the creation of the book as an object. And I've known and have dear friends who are writers who've done a lot of self-publishing. I don't feel particularly called to be published by the most prestigious presses. I just love being involved at every stage of writing and publication and the production of a book.
That's great. And you're coming up in poetry at a time when it's so feasible to do that. Yeah. And you don't have to be at the mercy of finding an independent press or a small press or large press. And you can kind of settle into seeing the whole process through. Yeah. It's exciting.
And I think it comes out of my values as a political person, which was to be very grassroots and to believe that sort of ordinary people living normal lives can be incredibly creative and have incredible influence on the world around them.
And I think some of that, you said you were educated in Bellingham at Fairhaven.
I was, yeah.
And that probably gave you the opportunity to explore that point of view.
Absolutely. It was a really rich, very valuable education, and particularly because one had to be very self-motivated.
And that's how you got to the Middle East, right?
Yes, yeah. They gave me a grant, the Adventure Learning Grant. It's a program that's still going on at Fairhaven, and it really changed my life.
you could choose that opportunity to go and work politically or be a witness to events in the Middle East.
Yes, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
I was very interested in the refugee situation, particularly Palestinian refugees. It's a very different experience from what we normally think of as refugees, because Palestinian refugee camps have been in existence for 50 or 60 years. They're built up. It's a generations-long existence now. So I first started in Lebanon, and I was volunteering in Shatila refugee camp, working with children, doing creative projects with them, creative writing, photo projects. I was learning Arabic. And so then I had the opportunity to travel around a bit to Syria, Turkey, Jordan. And I then entered Israel-Palestine. I was in the West Bank for quite a long time, about 4 months, working with the International Women's Peace Service. So documenting the occupation, going to demonstrations. But then one can cross over into Israel proper through checkpoints. I mean, not with a great deal of ease, but with an American passport, it's quite a bit easier. And so I'd spent time in Jerusalem and Haifa and Tel Aviv as well.
And you came back feeling, knowing anything that influences your poetry?
What I came back feeling was that I actually knew less definitively about the situation than I did before I had gone. I studied Palestine and also Kashmir, sort of the contested territory between India and Pakistan, at Fairhaven. That's what I built my concentration there around. So I'd had a lot of book knowledge, and I'd had a lot of political experience of saying, here are the talking points. And the real felt, lived, embodied experience of being under occupation, having soldiers point automatic rifles at you, being questioned, having incredibly restricted movement, seeing people with no economic opportunities, no educational opportunities, just holding on somehow. That has taken me years to process. And it's been about 10 years, and I moved to Port Townsend in part to say, I'm here to write about Palestine. I think Ernest Hemingway had said once, you don't go to Paris to write about Paris. You go to Paris to write about Ohio. And that's how I feel, that I'm really here to try to catch up with all these very rich experiences that I've had.
And you're doing that?
Yes.
And the chapbook includes those poems?
There are poems from my travels in the chapbook. My current work, since I moved to Port Townsend, is actually a series of poems based out of the hermit archetype. So having gone from being very open and involved in the world, coming to PT also felt a bit like a retreat and like a refuge.
The end of the earth here.
Yeah.
And I think that's often necessary when you're processing something so huge, and also for any writer, time alone to do
Absolutely.
it. I don't want to let go of the idea that you introduced, that your parents, as immigrants to this country, had the idea that being a doctor or an engineer were the proper and prestigious occupations. How did they cope with these changes in what you were? You weren't going to become a lawyer, which was already radical, you said. How did that work out?
My father passed about 5 years ago,
Sorry
actually. Thank you. And I think one of the most devastating things for him ever was that I didn't go to law school. He really wanted to see that. But on the other hand, when I did go to the University of Texas in Austin to study Urdu, they were both blown away, because Urdu is not an official language in India. It's a language that's associated with the Muslim population who are marginalized in India. And so they studied it at home with independent teachers. In school, they studied English and Hindi and Telugu, which is the regional language in Hyderabad, where they're from. So for me to be able, in the U.S., in Texas, to study their language and to become fluent, which I wasn't, and to be literate, which I hadn't been, I think there was some part of them that was extremely grateful and proud.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, good. So it kind of has a happy ending.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think at this point, my mother, we've experienced enough loss that she's really embraced all of us just wanting to find meaning and everyday richness in our lives.
Do you send her your poems?
I don't, actually. She has come to a reading that I've done. She still lives in Tri-Cities, where I grew up, and I organized some open mics there. So she's attended. She has my chapbook. And it's a challenge, because I grew up in a conservative Muslim family. They're still very practicing, and I'm not. To not censor myself in my writing and to be a very public writer in that way has been huge for me, and also incredibly empowering.
Yes, and I think that's the heart of the poet. Poet needs and does say things that make other people uncomfortable. Yeah. But I think in the end, poetry opens everybody's hearts. So while we're talking about that, perhaps this is a good time for you to read a poem.
I would love to. I'd love to read a poem that is from my upcoming chapbook about the hermit archetype, for which the working title is really just Hermit. The hermit learns to read. Upon entering the hermitage, she finds an empty cell, barred windows, one dim bulb, splintered table, and a map the hermit cannot decipher. Alien symbols, directions unknown, formless questions in the energy of pure emotion. How to call these colors? How to draw these lines? The hermit learns to read every map, the lined palm, the soul-stripped shoe, the scarred body, the places some have gone and others have yet to go. The hermit learns to ask the question, do I have the strength, the hiking boots, the headlamp to make the journey? The answer may be yes. The answer may be no. Finding it is nothing to walking the wild land alone. And yet, it is a first wisdom to learn to read the map.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila Bender talks with poet Afrose Ahmed about her life, her poetry, and the teaching of embodied writing.
We should mention now that you've been teaching a class at the Writers' Workshop here in Port Townsend. You call it embodied writing.
Yeah.
And now that we've heard some of your recent work, maybe you could tell us about that class and what you're conveying and the term embodied writing.
The full title of the class is Dancing on the Page, Moving into Embodied Writing. And the idea is, for me, again, comes out of this large transformation that happened when my sister passed away. It became clear to me that I actually had very little somatic or bodily awareness. And I really began to dive deeply into this world of emotions residing in the body. And that as a writer, we're quite often in our heads and in our monkey mind. And that's not necessarily that's not the place that I want to write from. And what I found as I began to engage in all these embodiment practices, such as dancing, rock climbing, and just tons of swimming and martial arts and hiking, was that my writing became so much more rich. It became wild and raw and visceral. And before, it had been a bit more clipped and restrained and sparse. And I still appreciate that aesthetic and enjoy working with it. There's now this internal rhythm and this force and this velocity that seems to emerge when I'm really in the environment and not in my mind.
Do you write in the environment, or you take home the experience with your body?
I do write in the environment, yeah. I find that that's very helpful. And when I first moved to Port Townsend, I was walking in the woods for an hour every day. And I was taking advantage of the local dance studio and dancing every morning.
And then writing.
And it also has come out of my first sort of introduction to embodied writing was John Lee's Writing from the Body. And so there are exercises, and I use them in my class along with other things that I've developed myself, to use the senses, for example. So one of the things we do in the class is to eat little bits of food with our eyes closed and talk about the experience. And it's so primal, particularly smell. We'll smell essential oils without being aware of what they are. And everybody has a deep childhood association with any of the smells that come around. So that's one of the ways that we access the body in our writing. We also do a lot of movement and a lot of breath work. And John Lee says that writer's block really happens in the body, that we're literally physically blocked in our muscles and our bones. And to move it out, to breathe it out, he has exercises where you scream as loudly as you can. So I've sent people in the workshop out into the hills in Fort Worden to just scream, silence, silence, to really quiet the mind and to quiet all the voices that are telling us to not express ourselves.
So they don't scream right in the workshop with other people?
No, they don't.
Yeah.
They're sent out.
What do they report after they come back having done it?
Some felt liberated. Some still felt quite self-conscious. Some felt, I already live out in the country and it's quite quiet. It's very silent. They found their own words. And I always encourage that. If the activity doesn't resonate, then they should find something else. But by the end of the 5 weeks of this course, everybody went home with a whole new toolbox to prompt writing that is really based in our natural environment and the body.
And you'll be teaching it again?
Yeah, I am planning a one-day workshop with the Writers' Workshop in January 16th. And the evening before, myself and Christy Webster, who's an amazing writer who also works at the Writers' Workshop, will be doing a reading there.
That's nice. Yeah. Very nice. So listeners should stay tuned to the Writers' Workshop readings and workshop schedule that comes around online and is posted in the window of the store. And while we're talking about places to work with you and hear more about you, let's talk about your website for a moment and then about your heart-crafted poems. So your website address is?
It's www.afrosefathimaahmed.com.
Maybe you should spell it.
And I will
name.
spell it out. So Afrose is spelled A-F-R-O-S-E. Fatima is F-A-T-I-M-A. And Ahmed is A-H-M-E-D. And that's my writing name, in part because Fatima is a matrilineal name. So if I had been born in India, I wouldn't have been given Ahmed, which is my father's last name, as a last name. I would have been given Fatima. So that's important to me because that comes from my mother's family.
One of the things you're known for around town is setting up at the farmer's market and offering to write heart-crafted poems.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
I came upon the idea, I think, first in Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones. I'm pretty sure she mentions doing it at some point in the 70s there as just kind of a writing exercise. And so I'd always been intrigued by it. I think it speaks to my very social sensibilities, my desire to have my audience and I be in a conversation. And then at some point last year, I did see a man doing it at the Fremont Fair, the Sunday market there in Seattle. And I spoke to him and he was quite encouraging and, someone else had mentored him into doing it. And so, I have this amazingly beautiful antique Royal typewriter. It's a 1925. It's incredibly old. It works amazingly and it's quite a conversation piece. So that's something that will draw people in. But people ask for a poem on a particular subject. They might just say, please write me a poem on love or loss or innocence. Or they may tell me a story about their life, something difficult that's happening for them. Or oftentimes it's silly, about a monkey riding a bicycle. And I don't know what happens for me. It feels very, very different from my own writing. And again, this goes back to the embodied writing and my ability to kind of be in the moment. But as I'm sitting there with a very looming deadline and my audience in front of me, an image will just pop into my head. And I may not know where it's going. I may not know why it's relevant to the topic. And I just have to go with it. And so I end up typing it out on a bit of parchment paper and giving it to them and accepting a donation for it. It's been so incredibly transformative. I have been blown away by people's response and the support that I've gotten. And so in part, I'm making a living doing this in Port Townsend, but also I've gone to Bremerton, I've gone to Port Angeles, Bainbridge Island, and I've managed to connect with people intensely and intimately in a 10 or 15 minute exchange. And I've also been sort of gifted and supported, not just with money, but with Reiki sessions, or with a night's stay at somebody's B&B, or food, all sorts of gifts. And so it's really allowed me to trust the creative process and trust that my voice is wanted and needed in the world. And that's immense for any writer.
Very, very affirming. So back to the actual event of someone coming to you and proposing a poem about a monkey riding a bicycle. And I'm trying to imagine doing it. So you're sitting there at some kind of table with your typewriter and parchment paper, and they come over and tell you what they'd like you to write about. Do they sit there while you're writing?
It's my preference that they sit there.
And they just sit there quietly?
They sit there quietly. Sometimes they talk to me. I mean, people will come up and speak as I'm writing. I have to be okay with that. I know that there's something unconscious happening for me. I sense that it's being a child of immigrants and sort of living cross-culturally and having traveled quite a bit. I have this ability to speak people's language and to mirror them. And it's odd. Quite often I'll read the poem to them once it's completed.
That's what I was going to ask. You read it to them.
I do read it to them. That is one of my favorite bits. But they'll say, you had no way of knowing this, but carnelians are incredibly important to me. My husband gave me a carnelian on our first anniversary. Or, wow, you had no way of knowing this, but you used this whole extended metaphor about sailing and boats. And the poem's for my husband, and he's a sailor. He has a sailboat. It feels like a bit of everyday magic.
Gratifying experience from beginning to end. How many of these can you do in one market session? Now
I've started to record them. In the past, I just kind of let them out into the universe. But now because people are very curious about them, I might end up doing anywhere from 20 to 50.
In how many hours?
In about 5 hours. Yeah.
So normally a poet would say, wow, if I could write a poem in 5 hours, that would be great.
They're not perfect. There are typos. I may end up repeating words when I didn't want to.
You have one you wanted to read to us?
I would love to read one to you, and I think I can find I can read the monkey riding a bicycle poem. I do have a Facebook page.
Can you tell us what it is? Is it your name?
It's Afrose Ahmed.
Tink you.
And I'll post these heart-crafted poems on a regular basis.
Wonderful.
A monkey riding a bicycle. In the circus of the whirligig swirl, down the sidewalks and freeways of the animal soul, one may chance upon the primate, all cocoa fur and hooting calls, holding itself erect above the two-wheeled jalopy of human imagination. The monkey rides. He pops, wheelies, spins out, and rides back in. The monkey is the psyche's calm traveler.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would say that's brilliant.
Thank you. And that was, that was written in Bremerton at their Thursday market for, I don't remember who, a couple weeks ago.
But you have permissions to, because they're your poems.
They're my poems, yeah.
So as we wind to a close here, I just have to say, one of the things I'm hearing in your discussion with us is the remarkable ability to be both social and connected and mirror other people and be a hermit or learn to be a hermit.
Right.
And I think that there's something to be said for all writers to imbibe that lesson, that in order to have a full experience to write about, we need to be of the world, of our bodies in the world. The world includes people. So it's lovely to hear in the poems you read both sides. And I think that you might have one more poem to read to us. Is this one from your chapbook?
I'm planning on placing it in an upcoming chapbook. It's going to be published in Juked magazine online. This poem, it's one of the first pieces I wrote that I felt was truly embodied and kind of just emerged from me about a week after I came out of a Vipassana meditation retreat. So it was 10 days of silent meditation, no writing, no reading. There are some expletives in this poem, which I cannot speak on the air, so I'm just going to kind of pause and not say them, so you'll notice that. I think it's a lovely piece. Singing to the band. When Hopeless Jack said, "This song is dedicated to my ex-girlfriend. It's called You're and I Never Loved You." The woo girls went about their wooing, And I heard him say, "Why did you hurt me so badly? I loved you so much." I wanted to brush my hands through his mohawk, tug on his 00 gauge tribal earrings, trace my fingers over his sleeves and neck tattoos and say, "Darlin', none of us are invincible, and none of them are infallible. Don't put the on a pedestal. Know that when you are on stage looking all sexy and killing it and the girls and boys are screaming for you and your body is making music that courses through their body, so they're jumping and dancing like they're on death row, all because you. Please know that that is the most alone you have ever been in your life. We are artists and musicians and writers because we are cobwebs on the branches of the most magical jungle plants, and they are heartbreakers and investment bankers and exotic dancers because they are vacuum cleaners with flashlights and machetes. That's just the way of the world, beautiful. To love that which is so different and horribly dangerous. It's why they love us too, because they know, even at the first, that 3 years later we'll be standing on a stage in Richland, Washington, calling them The handsome devil stood next to me after the set, so I went to him and shook his hand and said, "Amazing show, as per usual." And he asked, "How have you been?" And I thought about it for a moment and finally said, "You know, I've been really good, because the last time we met I had dropped my coffee mug onto my plate. I was so lost in the darkness and the drink. And I asked, 'How have you been?' And he said some things I can't remember through the haze the 3 Jack and Cokes make, but I remember that it was confused and not all good. And I said, 'Well, you know, that's okay. I'm full of ecstasy and full of rage in this very moment, and that's how things go sometimes.' He didn't say anything, just drank his drink and watched the headliners and then wandered off. Later, I wished I had told him how liberated he looked during that last song while he stood at the kit and then stood on the kit and played like a man possessed. He looked freer than I've ever felt. I want to feel like him, I had thought. He is a bendy tree shaped after the ink curling around his ribcage, wild and wizened and whipped. I drove home under the sky and asked the stars, which comes first, the man or the tattoo?
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk with you.
It's been incredibly lovely. Thank you.
Thank you for your brilliant poems.
Thank you, Sheila.
You have been listening to In Conversation, Discussions on Writing and the Writing Life with Sheila Bender. For more of Sheila's interviews, please go to Sheila's website, www.writingitreal.com/audio.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Announcer is Kurt Vanderslice.